Thresholds and Transits. My name is Megan. I'm happy that you're here. Today we're going to talk about Pallas Athena and the architecture of the patriarchal mind. So there's a version of your intelligence that was built for his approval. You know this. It's precise, rigorous, well-sourced, and careful not to claim too much. It anticipates the counter-argument before it even arrives. It frames itself in language the existing structure can recognize and validate. And it never quite takes up the full space of what it knows, because taking up the full space risks the assessment that it is too much, too certain, too direct, too emotional, too passionate, too presumptuous about its own authority. It has learned to manage its own audacity. It has gotten you real things, credentials and access and recognition, and the sense of being taken seriously in rooms that were not designed for you. And there's something underneath that intelligence that is older, less managed, and significantly more dangerous to the structure that trained you. The gap between these two versions of your intelligence, between the one that performs well inside the system and the one that operates from the source of your own knowing, that's the Pallas Athena question. And right now, in this week of the Neptune Cazimi, the Saturn Cazimi, Pallas is at 18 degrees Pisces, trining Jupiter at 15 degrees Cancer. And the sky is really asking, look directly at the gap and see and stop pretending that the gap does not exist. So this episode is not going to tell you that you are already sovereign and you just need to do mirror work to believe more. We are instead going to trace the actual development arc that women move through when they begin the long and specific work of decentering the patriarchy from their own intelligence. And the arc has stages. Each stage costs you something. And the current sky is saying that you cannot skip any of the stages. It's saying that you know to know where you are in the sequence and to understand what is being asked of you in the sequence. And to do that, we start with the myth. But first, if you don't know me, my name is Megan. Hi, I'm an astrology student. I'm happy that you're here. I love to see things. I love to see patterns and see connections of things. And so I was doing some research on Pallas, and I saw the trine that was happening. And I also have been going through my own decentering journey and writing on it. And so I wanted to combine all of these because I think that Pallas is such a great example of working on both sides, working inside the system and then learning about her history and learning who she is and from where she comes and doing the journey herself. My website is meganriley.eu. I have on that website in the astrology tab different readings that you can sign up for. I have a donation-based natal chart reading. And what is a natal chart? A natal chart is looking at your astrological chart. What are your gifts? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where's the tension? And where are the opportunities? That's about an hour long. And I'm doing those based on donations. And you can sign up on my website until March 31st. After March 31st, I have a small fee for the natal chart readings. I also have transit readings. What is a transit? A transit reading is looking at what's happening in the sky right now or this year. Some people are looking for what's a good day to get married or a good day to start a job or a good day to start a business or move across the country. So we can look for that. What are good days and also maybe where are tense days to avoid. That is a transit reading. And I am offering those on a donation basis until April 30th. And then after April 30th, there will be a small charge for the transit readings. I also have other things on the website you can check out. And if there's any question or problem, you can always just send me an email to megan@meganriley.eu. Okay, the myth they gave us and what it encodes. Pallas Athena springs fully formed from the forehead of Zeus. Armed, armored, ready. No mother, no childhood, no lineage, No connection to the goddesses who came before the Olympian order, nothing to the feminine knowledge traditions that predated Zeus. The acceptable form of female intelligence is the kind that has no mother. Born directly from the father, in service of his wars, loyal to his order, useful to his heroes. The myth doesn't describe a goddess, it encodes a contract. In Ortysia, Athena uses her own origin as the legal argument for acquitting Orestes of murdering his mother, Clytemnestra. She says, in one of the most consequential sentences in Western literary history, she favors the male in all things and is entirely her father's child. No mother gave her birth. The mother's blood does not count. The feminine intelligence that has been absorbed into the patriarchal order can be deployed to rule against the feminine principle itself. This is the function of the contract. But what the myth suppresses is what our retelling requires us to name. Before Zeus swallowed Metis, Metis was pregnant. The child growing inside her was Pallas. Zeus swallowed Metis because a prophecy told him a child of Metis would surpass him. First a daughter equal to him in vision, and then a son who would overthrow him entirely. The strategy of his was preemptive: swallow the source before the source can produce what the source is capable of producing. Incorporate the feminine wisdom tradition so thoroughly into the patriarchal body that it becomes invisible, inaccessible, indistinguishable from the structure that consumed it. Pallas was not born from the father's creativity. She was born from the father's theft of the mother's power. She carries Metis inside Zeus's stomach, inaccessible to her, and doesn't even know it. She believes her intelligence originates in the father because the father is the only origin story the myth allows. So here we start in the condition for this journey that we're mapping today. The women whose intelligence has been trained inside the institution begins from this position: brilliant, capable, formidable, and severed from the source of her own knowing. And it's in ways that she's not yet been given the tools to name. The severing happened before she even arrived. The inheritance was stolen before she could receive it. The mother was swallowed before the daughter was born. The journey is the work of finding the mother anyway. Stage 1, the intelligence that performs. The first stage is mastery within the terms the structure has set. This is the phase that most women spend the longest time in, not because they lack the courage or vision, but because the rewards are real and the costs of leaving are also real. And the stage is so thoroughly normalized that it doesn't announce itself as a stage at all. It announces itself as just how things are. It's the water that we swim in. In this stage, the intelligence is organized around a question that lives so far underneath the work that it can't be heard. The question is, does this meet the standard? Am I credible enough, rigorous enough, acceptable, physically acceptable? Will they take this seriously? And in this, those questions is not just the work, it's the woman herself. The legitimacy of her claim to be the one that is doing the work. The question of whether her intelligence is the kind of intelligence that counts. So the standard then belongs to the structure. The evaluation comes from the outside. And the outside, for women building intellectual and creative work inside the culture, has historically been the male gaze. Not just as sexual attention, though that's a part of it, but as the locus of institutional authority, the holder of the credential, the arbiter of what counts as rigorous and what counts as soft, what counts as analysis and what counts as feeling, what counts as scholarship and what is spiritually adjacent. Audre Lorde named the mechanism with precision in uses of the erotic. She wrote that In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. We've been taught to suspect the erotic. We've been warned against it in all of our lives by the male world, which values the depth of feeling enough to keep women around in order to exercise it in service of men. But it also fears the same depth as too much to examine the possibilities of it within themselves. The intelligence in stage 1 is producing real work, often extraordinary work. The problem is not the quality of what is being made. The problem is the direction it is being made in. Pallas in the mythology helps Perseus kill Medusa. She helps Odysseus find his way home. She assists Hercules through his labors. The intelligence is formidable and the direction is always outward, always toward the male hero's goal, always in service of a project that wasn't initiated from her own source of knowing. She's the brilliant woman in the room who's learned to make the men in the room more effective and has called that her work. This is a structural condition that is reproduced across generations because the rewards are structured to reproduce it. The credential goes to the woman who frames her intelligence in the terms that the institution recognizes. The publication goes to the argument that anticipates the dismissal before it arrives and preemptively defends against it. The access goes to the woman who makes the room more comfortable by managing her own audacity, who is rigorous in ways that do not destabilize the sense that the people granting access are the appropriate judges of rigor. The stage is not a trap you fall into out of weakness. It is a trap that is built into the structure of how female intelligence is rewarded and punished from the beginning of a woman's education. The woman who refuses it entirely from the start pays an enormous cost. The woman who moves through it and then beyond is the more common story, and that is the story that we are mapping today. So, what does it feel like from the inside? It feels like working very hard and occasionally wondering why the work doesn't feel like enough. It feels like achieving things and noticing that the achievement does not produce the sense of arrival that you expected. It feels like being very good at something and intermittently aware that being very good at it in the terms of the structure is not the same as doing the thing you actually came to do. There is a quality of slight unreality to the validation when it comes, as though the thing being validated is a performance of the self rather than the self, as though the credential belongs to a version of you that you constructed for the institution rather than to the intelligence that was present before the institution got it. Virginia Woolf describes in the experience of that gap in a room of one's own through the thought experiment of Shakespeare's sister. What if Shakespeare had a sister? The woman of equal genius for whom no structure existed, for whom every path to the expression of her intelligence was closed, who carried the fire and had nowhere to put it. Woolf's argument is not primarily about material conditions, though having a room of one's own to write and the 500 pounds in order to take care of oneself matter. It's about the condition under which a woman's intelligence is permitted to exist on its own terms. The woman writing with the male professor looking over her shoulder, even metaphorically, even as the internalized voice of the institution inside her head is not writing what she fully sees. The work produced under that supervision is real, but it's just not the whole of what she knows. And the turn doesn't arrive necessarily as an insight, it arrives as a fracture. Something breaks in the contract between the woman and the system. The approval might be withheld for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the work. The standard shifts mid-games in ways that make visible what was always true. The standard was never about the work. It was about managing the woman, about keeping intelligence useful and the woman controllable, rewarding the performance of acceptable intelligence and punishing the intelligence that operates from its own source. Or the approval is granted and it is empty. The credential arrives and the sense of arrival does not come with it. The woman in the room, she entered, she worked to enter, and she is aware that the room is not the room she was working toward. That the validation the institution just provided doesn't reach the part of her that it needed to be reached. That something that she's been doing in order to receive this recognition is something that she can no longer do. Adrienne Rich named this in Of Woman Born as the moment the institution and the experience become irreconcilable. The institution of femininity, of acceptable womanhood, of credentialed female intelligence, it has a script. And every woman who moves through educational and professional structures learns that script at a cellular level. How to frame intelligence so that it doesn't alarm, how to make the claim without claiming too much, how to be rigorous without being threatening, how to be present in the room without the full presence that would make the room uncomfortable. The script isn't a lie, it's real intelligence, but it's not the whole of the experience, and the experience eventually refuses to be contained. The fracture is the moment the experience breaks through the institution's management of it, and it's painful. And it's not because something is going wrong, something's going right. But the woman who experiences this fracture is not falling apart. She is refusing, for the first time, to continue performing the version of her intelligence that the structure rewarded. And the refusal feels like loss before it feels like anything else. Gloria Anzaldúa named this phase in Borderlands, La Frontera, as the Coteque state, the dark, ambiguous, the place where the old organizing system failed and the new one is not yet formed. Coteque is the Aztec earth goddess who is both creative and destructive, who wears a skirt of serpents and a necklace of hands and hearts and skulls, who is the source of life and death simultaneously. This state is the experience of being in the dissolution between structures. The intelligence that was organized around the external standard lost its organizing center. The intelligence that will operate from the internal source has not yet found its form. From the outside, it looks like crisis. From the inside, it's passage. The woman who skips it, who finds a way to reattach to the external standard before she completed the dissolution, goes back to stage one with less capacity to question it. The question who stays in the Coteque state long enough, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me, long enough for something new to form on the other side is the woman who becomes capable of working from the source rather than from the structure. So stage two, the work becomes the organizing principle. What comes after the fracture is not freedom from difficulty. In some ways, the work even gets harder. The scaffolding, the external standard provided, is gone. The sense of direction that the credential gave, the sense of working towards something that the structure would recognize and reward, is no longer available. The woman is building without that navigation system, and she has to find a different one. The different navigation system is the work itself, not the work as performance, not the work as credential, but the work as the thing that has its own demands, its own requirements, its own internal standard of what is true and what is insufficient. The shift is from producing the work for an audience that validates it to producing the work because the work itself requires it being produced. It's not simple. The internalized male gaze doesn't disappear when the external one loses its power. The voice of the institution is inside the woman's head, and it has been there since before she was old enough to question it. The question that organized stage 1, does this meet the standard, continues to rise. The difference in stage 2 is that the woman has developed enough internal orientation to recognize the question as the institution's voice rather than just the truth of the situation, and to choose repeatedly and with effort to answer a different question instead. And the different question is, does this meet the demand of what I actually know? So I'm going to go off script for just a couple minutes and share some of my experience. I've been in this, I shared decentering, kind of like consciously, knowingly decentering since 2020-ish. And I noticed a few things. I noticed a few things in how I would approach my work, in how my work felt, and how my business has really transformed over the time. What was unsatisfying was how I had designed the business around what I thought it needed to be and what was really acceptable. And then really pulling back into, okay, what am I being called for? What is this work really? What is the work that needs to be expressed through me? And that was turning the work more somatic, more into sensuality and sexuality, and being able to lead from there and being able to speak about that. And then what changed, so also as I'm going through this, I also am going through perimenopause. I am going through my diagnosis with autism. My mother was leaving the planet, right? All of these things are all happening at the same time. And I left the US. And I noticed as I'm going through this process of really changing the work into what I know instead of an acceptable version of what I know, is also what was happening with my appearance and my relationship to my appearance. So I don't know how then to say this. Like, a lot of women have a difficult relationship with appearance and a difficult, complicated relationship with their body. I certainly did. I had a lifelong eating disorder, and relationship to then the structure and the structure of what is acceptable, and then how then do the thoughts, what thoughts are arising within the structure. So then I really had to look at how, being the eldest of 3 and the only girl, how my upbringing was different than the boys, and what was happening in the family unit, which is of no fault to my parents. They're inside the structure. And then what's happening in school inside that unit, and what then was the underlying education that was happening. What were the underlying messages that I was picking up that my brothers were not getting? And then more about physical appearance. So I went through a stage. When I was going through stage 1, I was responding to people if they would comment on my eyes, or hair or body, was, thanks, the least interesting thing about me is my eyes, or my eyes are the least interesting thing about me. Thanks, my tattoos are the least interesting thing about me. To pull the energy away from appearance and then to put it back on the work. And trying to get the system to change and stop making comments on appearance, which is, that's what the system does, right? Is to approve or disapprove based on the look of someone, the external look of someone, rather than what work are they producing, where's their heart, what's happening. And so I would try and make the people that cared about me and I cared about change the question, or change then how they were approaching me and turn it back to the work. But that was still trying to change the structure from the inside. So then as I moved into stage 2, and then we'll talk about stage 3, it was knowing that they're going to ask the question from inside the structure. I can answer it from outside the structure, and they may accept it or not, but it's at least I'm answering the question for myself. and I'm going to answer the question and then provide the work for myself. So that's really being able to create this channel and communicate these ideas with you is really about the work. It's also a reason why, for now, this is a faceless channel, because I don't want the focus to be on appearance and the weird facial expressions I'm making as I'm reading and as I'm going through all the different aspects of what it is that I have prepared for you. I don't want my attention on appearance. I also don't want to have to make the camera the right, and I don't want to get made up, and I don't want to go through that right now. The focus right now is on the work. Okay, so I'll go back on script now, and we'll connect it back again in the rest of stage 2 and the rest of stage 3 of what's becoming available as then we move through the stages. And it's not so much about not the system, but being able to incorporate the system only from a different place. Okay, so the question of, does this meet the demand of what I actually know? Audre Lorde wrote of the erotic in the clearest map of what this navigation system actually feels like. She describes the erotic as a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. She writes about it as a kind of satisfaction, the felt sense of doing the work well by the standard of your own deepest knowing. That satisfaction is the navigation system, and when the work meets it, it's true. When the work misses it, something is off with the direction, even if the quality is technically adequate. This is a completely different relationship to the work than stage 1 provides. In stage 1, the question of whether the work is good is answered by the structure. In stage 2, it's answered by the body's sense of whether the work is true. Audre Lorde describes not an abandonment of rigor, but a relocation of the rigor source from the external evaluator to the internal one, from the institution to the erotic, and from the gaze to the knowing. The work produced in this stage is different from the work produced in stage 1. It's what Virginia Woolf is pointing to when she describes the woman writer who has the room and 500 pounds writing differently than the woman who does not. The work that emerges when the organizing question changes is more specific, it's more direct, it's less managed. It's more willing to claim what it knows without the preemptive defensive framing that characterizes the performance of acceptable intelligence. It also is more vulnerable in a specific way. It cannot fall back on the credential or the institutional affiliation to establish its legitimacy. Its legitimacy comes from the quality of its relationship to the truth, which is more demanding and less legible kind of authority than the institution kind. Women building from this stage often encounter the wound that Venus conjunct Chiron in Aries named for us earlier this week, the wound around whether the work is legitimate without the external validation, whether the intelligence is real without the credential, whether the claim to authority is presumptuous when it's not backed by the institution's approval. That wound is more accurate precisely when the work is truest, because the work that is truest is also the work that has moved furthest from the external standard and therefore has the least institutional protection. Demetra George in Asteroid Goddesses describes Pallas Athena and the positive expression as the intelligence that integrates masculine and feminine principles, the strategy and the wisdom, the sword and the serpent, the capacity for direct action and the capacity for pattern recognition that operates below the surface. In stage 2, the woman is beginning to access both of these capacities simultaneously, instead of just acceptable masculine intelligence in service of the structure and suppressing feminine knowing that the structure can't categorize. The integration is the work of the stage. So now we go to stage 3, and I'm going to have some tea. The return of Metis. Metis is still inside of Zeus. The wisdom tradition that was swallowed before Pallas was born hasn't been destroyed. It was incorporated, held captive, made inaccessible by being absorbed into the very structure that depends on its suppression. But it has not been eliminated. And when a woman moved through the fracture and began to build from the internal source rather than the external standard, she begins to hear something underneath the Olympian order, the older voice, the mother's knowing, the intelligence that predates the structure's claim to have produced it. Silvia Federici's argument in Caliban and the Witch is that the witch trials of the 15th through the 17th century were not primarily about superstition or religious fervor. They were the systematic elimination of women's uncodified knowledge, the herbal medicine, reproductive knowledge, the capacity to heal outside the emerging structures of medicine, and understanding of the body that women had developed and transmitted across generations, and that capitalism required to be destroyed in order to enclose the commons and make the female body and the female labor legible only within the terms of the new economic order. Metis, in Federici's historical account, is the knowledge that women possessed before the enclosure, the intelligence that the structure had to swallow in order to build the world that we inhabit. The return of Metis in stage 3 is the woman beginning to trace her own intelligence back through the institutions that shaped it to the source that preceded them. They're not rejecting the rigor developed inside the structure, but asking where the rigor was already present before the institution had it. Finding the lineage of women who knew things before the structure gave them the permission to know. Recovering the specific forms of intelligence that the patriarchal account of knowledge has been categorizing as not quite rigorous, not quite scholarly, too personal, too emotional, too embodied, too feeling-based to count as the real thing. This is where the feminist scholarly lineage becomes not just important but necessary. The woman in stage 3 is not building alone. She's in the process of discovering that she has never been building alone, that the work that she's doing has a genealogy that predates her, that the intelligence that she's learning to trust from her own source has been trusted and built from and transmitted by women across centuries in conditions far more hostile than her own. The Declaration of Sentiments didn't appear from nowhere. It emerged from 50 years of women writing and speaking about their inequality in private letters and public lectures and published books before anyone called it a movement. The second sex did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from Beauvoir's reading of the woman who preceded her, and from the specific intellectual tradition that she was in dialogue with and arguing against simultaneously. Asteroid goddesses did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from Demetra George's years of practice, her engagement with the mythological scholarship, and her understanding of what the existing astrological tradition had been suppressing about the feminine. Finding the lineage is finding the mother that the patriarchal myth said Pallas never had. And that this finding isn't sentimental, it's structural. The woman who discovers that her intelligence has a genealogy outside the institution that trained her discovers simultaneously that the institution's claim to have produced her intelligence is partial and provisional and dependent on the suppression of what came before. That discovery changes the relationship to the credential. The credential is real, but it's also not the whole story of where the knowing comes from. Anzaldúa's Borderlands is the most precise map of this stage because Anzaldúa is operating at the intersection of multiple suppressed lineages simultaneously: indigenous, Chicana, female, queer, and the specific tradition that knows from the body and the borderland rather than from the center. Her concept of the new mestiza consciousness is the consciousness that can hold multiple, contradictory, officially incompatible ways of knowing simultaneously without needing to resolve them in a single coherent system that the dominant structure can process. This is what the return of Metis requires, the capacity to hold the rigor developed inside the institution, alongside the knowing that precedes the institution, to let them coexist and inform each other without requiring either to submit to the other's terms. The woman in stage 3 is doing the active work of recovering what was swallowed. In practice, reading the women that canon excluded, following the citations in the feminist scholarship back to the women that they cite who are not in citation, sitting with the forms of knowledge the structure classified as soft or spiritual or personal, and asking what they actually know. Learning to trust the intelligence that operates below the surface of what the institution can see. Stage 4, sovereignty and the dissolution of the gaze. The word sovereignty is used a lot right now in contemporary spiritual culture. It's been softened into something that sounds like self-confidence or self-love or believing in yourself, and that's not what we're talking about here. Sovereign intelligence, in the sense that we are using it, is the intelligence that has located its own source and builds from there. Not in isolation, not without rigor, not without the lineage and the scholarship and the precision that stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3 developed, but with a fundamental change in the organizing center. The evaluation comes from inside rather than outside, from the erotic standard Lorde talks about rather than the institutional standard the structure provides. And from the relationship of the work to the truth rather than from the relationship of the work to the gaze. What changes when the gaze loses its power is not that the gaze disappears. The culture that evaluates women's intelligence by its usefulness to the existing order does not disappear when a woman stops being organized by it. The dismissal continues, the absorption continues, the misidentification of depth as softness, of political analysis as spiritual consolation, of rigorous historical sourcing as astrology content, and all of it continues. The difference is that the evaluation no longer lands in a place where it used to land. The woman moved. And the place where the evaluation used to land, the place inside her that was waiting for the structure's assessment of whether the intelligence was real, is no longer the organizing center. She built a different organizing center, and the gaze cannot even reach it. Lorde again, because she's amazing and irreplaceable on this, our erotic knowledge empowers us, because a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. And this is a grave responsibility, projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient or the shoddy or the conventionally expected or the merely safe. The erotic standard doesn't permit the manageable version. It requires the full version. And the woman who built her organizing center, there is no longer in a position to produce the manageable version, even when it would be safer. This is a difficult place to work from because sovereignty has its costs. The woman building from the source rather than from the structure is building without the scaffolding that the institution provides. It's without what would make the work's depth legible to audience who cannot see depth without the scaffolding. The Chiron wound is present. The question of legitimacy is present. The gap between what the work actually is and what the container in it lives allows people to assume all of it, and all of that is present. The difference is that the presence of those difficulties no longer determines the scope of what is built. The wound doesn't set the ceiling. The question of legitimacy does not stop the work. The gap between the depth of the work and the legibility of the container is a problem to be worked with, not a reason to reduce the work to the dimensions the container can process. Pallas at sovereignty is still the warrior goddess. She's still strategic, still rigorous, still operating with the precision that Hellenistic astrology gives her, the capacity to see patterns, to hold complex configurations, to deploy intelligence in service of something that really matters. The weapons are the same. The direction has changed. She's no longer in service of Perseus's campaign to kill Medusa. She found the older story, the pre-Hellenic Athena with the serpents on her breastplate, the goddess who carries the severed Medusa head not as a trophy, but as the reclaimed wisdom of the dark sister. The older feminine knowing that the patriarchal myth converted into a monster because it was too threatening to leave intact. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, woman, in the yellow wallpaper is maybe the most precise literary portrait of what the gaze does to the female intelligence. She is a woman who knows something, who sees something in the wallpaper, and who has an internal life of genuine complexity and perception. And then the structure built specifically to manage her, which is she has to rest. And she has a physician husband, and a nursery room has been designed to prevent that knowing from producing anything. She goes mad, and the knowing breaking through the management, she tears the wallpaper. She hasn't healed, she's initiated. The intelligence the structure spent the entire story suppressing has finally exceeded the structure's capacity to contain it. Sovereign Pallas doesn't wait for the wallpaper to force the issue. She's been building through all 4 stages and the internal resources of her to act from her own knowing without waiting for the institution to grant permission. Pallas in Pisces, trine Jupiter in Cancer. So Pallas is at 18 degrees Pisces this week, forming a trine to Jupiter at 15 degrees Cancer. This is the aspect that carries what we've been talking about. Pallas in Pisces is the intelligence in its pre-language form. Pisces is the sign of dissolution, of the collective unconsciousness, of the knowing that moves below the surface of what the structure can categorize. The Pallas in Pisces intelligence doesn't announce itself through direct confrontation. It operates in the space where the next form is gathering before it found its Aries fire. It sees patterns in the water. It knows things about where the current is moving before anyone named the direction. Demetra George calls this the enlightened warrior of nonviolent resistance, the strategy that is invisible to the system, accustomed to reading strategy as something that declares itself. Jupiter in Cancer is the great benefic in its sign of exaltation. Cancer is the root, the nourishment, the belonging, home, the sense of being held by something that doesn't require you to perform. Jupiter in Cancer is the expansive generosity of the nourishing ground, not Jupiter in the grand gesture, Jupiter in the public declaration, in the feeding, in belonging to the home that holds the work while it is being made. The water trine between them is the intelligence flowing into the nourishing root without friction. Piscean knowing, the pre-language intelligence that's been built through all 4 stages of this arc, flowing into Cancer that will sustain it. And the historical record confirms what the aspect does too. In February 1963, when Pallas was at 6 degrees Cancer, trining Jupiter in Pisces, the feminine mystique traveled to 3 million women in its first 3 years because it moved through feeling rather than argument. The intelligence dissolved into the collective field and was received because women reading it recognized their own lives in it before they finished the analysis. In 1986, when Pallas was at 5 degrees Leo, trining Jupiter in Pisces, asteroid goddess seeded the generation of practitioners who are still working from that framework 40 years later. I use it every day. The trine to Pisces Jupiter marks the moments where the feminist framework finds wide reception, not through confrontation, but through recognition. In 2026, the trine reversed direction. Pallas is now in Pisces and Jupiter is in Cancer. The collective visionary intelligence is flowing into Cancer, into the root, into the nourishing ground. After the years of going wide, of the framework traveling through the culture and being received, this trine is asking the work to go deep, to find the ground that holds it, and to build the root system instead of just extend the canopy. So here's what happens when a woman who has moved through all 4 stages of this arc arrives at this sky. The intelligence that was performing for the gaze in stage 1, that fractured and rebuilt its organizing center in stage 2, that found the severed lineage and recovered Metis in stage 3, arrives at stage 4 at the capacity to nourish rather than perform. The work that comes from the sovereign source is capable of feeding people at the root level, at the level of belonging that doesn't require external validation, at the level of the recognition that Lorde describes. It's a sharing of joy. It's emotional, psychic, intellectual. It forms a bridge between the sharers, which can then be the basis for understanding much of what is not being shared. So the Neptune Cazimi is on March 22nd, and that asked, what do you know that hasn't been given permission to exist? Then we have the Saturn Cazimi on March 25th, and that is asking, what are you building from the knowing? Now, Pallas in Pisces, trining Jupiter in Cancer, asks the third question, the one that comes after vision and commitment. What ground are you building it in? Whose nourishment does this work serve? What lineage does it honor? What mother does it find? And the woman who moved through the stages of this arc knows the answer to those questions from the inside rather than outside. The ground is the community that receives the work at the root level, not the institution that validates the credential. The nourishment is the feeding of people who need what the work actually is, not a performance of the people who need the work to be manageable and look good. The lineage is Metis, recovered, named, honored, the feminine wisdom tradition that predates the structure and exceeds it and has been building across every suppression and every partial victory and every absorption and every renewed demand for as long as the demand has been necessary. The intelligence born from Zeus's head has been doing the long work of finding its own source, not rejecting the rigor developed inside the patriarchal structure, but tracing it back through the theft to what was swallowed before the story started, to the knowing that what was present before the institution claimed to have produced it, to Metis and to the lineage of women who have been carrying her knowing in conditions that required them to carry it in secret, in code, and at enormous personal cost, but carried it anyway. Pallas in Pisces, the strategy before the sword, the knowing before the demand, the intelligence finding the mother, the myth that she never had. And the trine to Cancer Jupiter says the ground is ready to receive it. So, the question, what do you know?